It's our first Sunday without Pastor John. Gone through a few cartons of ice cream this week, but that's not too unusual for me. Well, friends, a lot of you know that I love movies, maybe a little too much. But my favorite film genre, contrary to what you may think, is not fantasy. It's Westerns. It has been said that Westerns are the last pure film genre. It was said by me just now. But one of the quintessential themes of a great Western is the growing tension between the good guy and the bad guy. From the very beginning of the movie, a great Western slowly builds in conflict until the final showdown, the final shootout between good and evil. That's not too unlike the Gospel of Mark. When you read chapter 2, especially in Mark's Gospel, one of the first things you notice is the growing tension between the Pharisees and Jesus. The tension builds like a great Clint Eastwood film. The first incident happens when Jesus heals the paralytic in the beginning of chapter 2. You might remember the story. Before actually healing the man, Jesus says to him, "Son, your sins are forgiven." It's absolutely a radical statement for anyone to make. So, of course, the religious leaders are furious. Who can forgive sins, they say, but God alone? And the tension builds. The next incident occurs after Jesus recruits Levi to be one of his disciples. Levi, who's also a tax collector. Not that Levi, don't worry. But when Jesus goes to Levi's house to have a meal, he sits with a bunch of unsavory characters, more tax collectors and sinners. But when the Pharisees see this, they complain again. Why on earth would Jesus eat with those people? To which Jesus famously responds, "It is not those who are well that are in need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners." And the tension builds. And the Pharisees complain a third time about Jesus, wondering, Jesus, why is it that your disciples don't fast like all the other disciples? The tension builds. And then finally we get to our text this morning where the tension boils over to the point where the Pharisees start conducting their dark plot to murder Jesus. But this time, the tension, the conflict is around Sabbath, that most sacred practice for Jewish people. The two most important badges for the ancient Jewish people, those cultural identity markers, were circumcision and keeping the Sabbath. You could be stoned to death if you were caught working on the Sabbath. Although that probably didn't happen very often. More likely you would have been verbally reprimanded or fined. But remember, keeping the Sabbath was one of the 10 commandments. We read in Exodus 20, "Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath unto the Lord. You shall do no work." Clearly, God cares about the Sabbath. I mean, it's right up there with don't kill people, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't worship other gods. But as Jesus points out to the Pharisees in our text this morning, the problem wasn't with the commandment. The problem was with how the Pharisees interpreted the commandment. See, the Pharisees made it their job to police everyone on exactly how the Sabbath should be kept. In fact, in the Talmud, Jewish rabbis outlined 39 forms of work that are forbidden on the Sabbath. But Jesus tells the Pharisees, you guys are missing the point. Sabbath is a gift. The Sabbath was made for you, not the other way around. In fact, all of the law, which the book of James calls the law of freedom, is a gift meant to enhance the life of God's people. It's an important point for us to remember because a lot of Christians today completely dismiss the law and the Old Testament as bad or oppressive. But remember what Jesus said about the law in Matthew chapter 5. I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Jesus is the complete embodiment of what the original law was intended to be. But of course, leave it to humans to take something that is meant for good and make it bad. And that's the problem with legalism, isn't it? Which is why Jesus gets really upset in the second part of our text this morning. The scene shifts from the grain fields to a synagogue where the Pharisees are watching Jesus to see if he's going to cure a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath. Interestingly, the rabbis of Jesus' day even debated whether or not you could give medical assistance on the Sabbath. According to the Mishnah, which is a collection of oral traditions from the ancient rabbis, you were allowed to give medical assistance on the Sabbath in only extreme situations when someone's life was in danger. But again, for Jesus, according to Jesus, the Pharisees are missing the point. The Sabbath was meant to be a gift. And what was the purpose of that gift? Rest. Rest. Sabbath means rest. But with rest, there comes rejuvenation and even healing. When your body rests, your body is allowed and able to heal, to recover. So you could even go as far to say is that the Sabbath is designed to do good and save and preserve life. So Jesus brings the man forward with the withered hand and he says, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? Do you understand what he's saying? Are you going to deny this man the very thing that Sabbath is intended to give all of us? Restoration and healing. But how do they respond? Silence. And the scripture says that Jesus looked at the Pharisees, he became angry, and he was grieved as he saw their hardness of heart. They just don't get it. Now think about the man with the withered hand. What was his life like? He only had one good arm, which probably meant he was unable to work. Remember, most jobs in the ancient world were physically demanding jobs, and most people were poor day laborers. And a one-armed man would not have been an employer's first choice, or a second choice, or a third choice, or a fourth choice. During the recession of 2008, my wife Sarah worked for a company called Ability First, and it was her job to help people with physical and mental disabilities get a job. Every day she would go in and talk to employers, call up businesses, trying to advocate for her clients. In 12 months of hard work, do you want to know how many disabled clients my wife placed? 0. Only people with disabilities really understand what life would have been like for the man with a withered hand. And it would have been worse in the first century, too. He was probably a beggar, which makes sense because beggars would often hang out around the synagogue hoping for some charity. Again, think about this man's life. Have you ever had to ask for money? Have you ever needed charity? It's a hard thing to do. And that would have been his existence every single day. This, my friends, is why Jesus is so angry. How many times is he actually, when we read the New Testament, how many times is Jesus truly angry? This is one of the few times. He's mad. Because the Pharisees care more about whether or not Jesus is going to obey their interpretation of the law more than the fact that this guy's life is about to be radically changed for the good. Not to mention the fact that they are about to witness a real, live miracle. And they don't care. Talk about hard-hearted. But why were the Pharisees that way? Could it be that they had been corrupted by religion? Is that a weird thing for a pastor to say? What I mean to say is, could they have been corrupted by a legalistic form of religion? Because the fundamental conflict of this text is actually not about Sabbath, but about the seismic difference between legalistic religion and the truth, power, and beauty of the gospel. And here's the main point of our sermon today. Religion without Christ, without grace, becomes toxic. I love what Tim Keller said about the difference between religion and the gospel. He says, religion is this: I obey in order to be loved and accepted. But the gospel is this: I am loved and accepted, therefore I obey. Without Christ, religion easily slips into a works-based faith. And that happens to you and me all the time if you really think about it. There's something about us humans, our insecure, sinful nature. We get stuck trying to prove ourselves, stuck trying to justify our existence. We compete against each other. We envy one another. We look down upon those that we perceive to be less than us. Well, I know I'm not perfect, but at least I'm not as bad as her or him. And even if we say we believe in the gospel, we're really quick to forget it come Monday morning. Martin Luther is credited to have said, I preach the gospel to my church every week because every week they forget it. But we think, if we can do our religion the right way, then we're doing good. We're better than others, right? If we can do my religion the right way, God's going to answer my prayers. God's going to bless me. I'm going to go to heaven when I die. If I can just do it the right way and continue to prove myself. But Christ wants to set you free from that kind of thinking, friends. Because he knows exactly how incredibly exhausting it is to live your life trying to justify your existence every day. We know that good old verse when Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. What's another word for rest? Sabbath. Jesus says, I am Lord of the Sabbath. He is Lord of rest. And you can only truly rest, that deep spiritual rest and peace, when you allow yourself to accept the gospel, when you allow yourself to stop competing against other people, when you stop trying to earn God's favor, when you remember the beauty and grace of God's love, the depth of his love as demonstrated to us by Christ on the cross. I hope you have seen the movie Chariots of Fire. If you have not, you need to rethink your choices. But the movie, which is based on a true story, centers around two British runners trying to earn gold medals in the Olympics. The two runners, Harold Abrahams and Eric Liddell. And as you follow the movie, you see this stark contrast between the two runners and their approach, not just to running, but to life. Eric Liddell is a Christian who, interestingly enough, refuses to run on the Sabbath. But his most famous quote in the movie is, "God made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure." And that perfectly encapsulates Eric, his life, his faith. He feels the love of God. He doesn't run on the Sabbath from a legalistic perspective. He doesn't run on the Sabbath because he feels the love of God. But Harold Abrahams is different. And he has an important quote in the movie as well. You might not remember it, but it's still powerful. He says, "I'm 24 years old, and I've never known contentment. And when that race starts, I've got 10 seconds to justify my whole existence." Do you hear the difference between the two runners? One runs feeling a pleasure of God, while the other one runs trying to justify his whole existence. So my final question for you this morning is, which are you? Do you run the race of faith in order to earn love and acceptance, or do you run the race of faith because you know deep down in your bones you are already loved and accepted? That's the difference between legalism and the gospel.